When the Nguyen family walked onto the Family Feud stage in September 2018, they made history without saying a single word. All five members were profoundly deaf, born without hearing, living in a world of silence that most people couldn't imagine. The producers had panicked when they received the application. How do you run a game show that depends entirely on verbal communication when an entire family can't hear the questions or speak the answers? The easy solution would have been to politely decline, to say the format didn't accommodate this situation, to move on to the next family on the waiting list of thousands. But Steve Harvey didn't take the easy solution. He took the right one. For 3 weeks before the taping, while maintaining his regular hosting schedule, his comedy tours, and his radio shows, Steve Harvey spent every spare moment learning American Sign Language, not fluently. He'd be the first to admit his signing was clumsy, grammatically incorrect, and sometimes completely wrong. But he learned enough to ask basic questions, enough to say good answer, and I'm sorry, and thank you for being here. Because Steve understood something that changed how he approached that episode. Effort matters more than perfection, trying matters more than succeeding, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show someone that they're worth the work. What happened on that Family Feud stage wasn't just a game show, it was a moment when television proved it could belong to everyone. When a deaf family showed millions of hearing viewers what communication really means. And when Steve Harvey, who'd built his career on quick wit and verbal comedy, discovered that the most meaningful conversation he'd ever had on television happened largely without sound. The family who never expected to be seen. The Nguyen family lived in Portland, Oregon. Parents David and Lynn, both 45, had been deaf since birth. Their 3 children, Michael, Jenny, and little Tommy, were also born profoundly deaf. A completely deaf family unit, which is actually relatively rare. About 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents, making the Nguyen family part of a unique 10%. David worked as a graphic designer. Lynn was a teacher at the Oregon School for the Deaf. Michael was in college studying architecture. Jenny worked at a bookstore. Tommy was finishing high school, a normal family living normal lives, except they did it all without hearing a single sound. They communicated in American Sign Language, a complete language with its own grammar, syntax, and regional dialects. At home they signed. At work, David had interpreters for client meetings. Lynn taught in ASL. The kids had grown up in both deaf and hearing worlds, navigating the constant translation between the two. They'd been Family Feud fans for years. The show was accessible to them through closed captioning, and they loved the family dynamics, the humor, the competition. David was particularly good at predicting answers. He'd watch episodes with his family, signing his guesses before the contestants revealed theirs, keeping score just like Robert Martinez had done with his notebooks. In early 2018, Michael suggested they apply. Why not us? He signed to his family. We're a family, we can compete, we just do it differently. David was hesitant. They won't accommodate us. Game shows aren't made for deaf people. But Lynn disagreed. If we don't try, we'll never know. And maybe it's time someone showed them that deaf families can do this too. They applied in March 2018. The application asked about unique family characteristics. In the essay section, Michael wrote, "We are a family of 5. We are funny, competitive, close-knit, and we love Family Feud. We also happen to be completely deaf. We know that's different. We know it complicates things, but we believe that families like ours deserve to be seen on television too, and we promise, if you give us a chance, we'll make it work." The application that changed everything. When Jennifer Morrison, the executive producer, saw the Nguyen family application, her first reaction was logistical panic. Family Feud depended on verbal communication, buzzers, quick answers, Steve's rapid-fire questions. How could they possibly make this work? Her second reaction after the panic subsided was shame. Shame that her first instinct had been, "This is too hard," instead of "How do we make this happen?" Jennifer brought the application to Steve during a production meeting. "We've got a situation," she said, explaining the Nguyen family. "I'm not sure how we'd handle it technically. We'd need interpreters. Maybe cards with written questions? I don't know. It might be too complicated." Steve looked at the application, read Michael's essay, then he looked up at Jennifer with an expression she'd never seen before. "We're doing this," he said firmly. "Steve, the logistics. I don't care about the logistics. Figure them out. This family deserves to be on this show just like every other family. And we're going to make sure they have the same experience as everyone else." How? I don't know yet, but we start by showing them respect. Real respect. Not accommodation, not charity, respect. Over the next 2 weeks, the production team worked with deaf community consultants to develop a plan. They'd have ASL interpreters on stage, one for each family. The interpreters would sign Steve's questions. The family would sign their answers back. The interpreters would voice those answers for Steve and the audience. But Steve wanted more than that. What if I learned some sign language, he asked. Basic stuff, enough to communicate directly with them sometimes, without always going through interpreters. The consultants were surprised but supportive. They warned him. ASL isn't easy. It's not just hand gestures, it's a complete language with its own grammar. 3 weeks wasn't enough to become fluent. I don't need to be fluent, Steve said. I just need to show them I tried. So Steve Harvey, 61 years old, already juggling multiple jobs, started learning American Sign Language. The 3-week crash course. Steve hired Maria Chen, a deaf ASL instructor, to teach him. They met every morning at 6 a.m. before Steve's other commitments. 1 hour of intensive instruction, finger spelling, basic signs, question structures, praise phrases. Maria was patient but honest. Your grammar is terrible. She'd sign to him through an interpreter during their sessions. You're basically signing like Tarzan. Me happy. You good? But you know what? Your effort is beautiful. The deaf community will see that you tried. That means more than perfect grammar. Steve struggled with finger dexterity. His hands, used to holding microphones and game cards, felt clumsy, forming the precise shapes of letters and words. He practiced constantly, in his car between appointments, in his dressing room, at home with his wife. He learned to sign, "Welcome to Family Feud." Good answer. I'm sorry, not on the board. You won. Thank you for being here. You are wonderful. Basic phrases, imperfect but sincere. Maria taught him something crucial. In deaf culture, effort matters. If a hearing person tries to sign, even badly, it shows respect. It shows you're willing to meet us in our language instead of always demanding we accommodate yours. That's huge. Steve also learned about deaf culture, not just language. He learned that many deaf people don't see deafness as a disability, but as a cultural identity. That there's a rich history of deaf community, deaf art, deaf theater, that ASL is as complex and expressive as any spoken language. That being deaf doesn't mean being less, just different. I've been in entertainment for 40 years, Steve said during one interview. I thought I understood communication. But learning ASL taught me that I'd been living in a tiny box. There's a whole world of communication I never knew about, and it's beautiful. By the time the Nguyen family's taping date arrived in September 2018, Steve's ASL was still elementary. But he'd practiced their names in finger spelling. He'd learned the signs for family, deaf, proud, and respect, and he'd memorized one complete sentence in ASL that he planned to use at the right moment. The day everything changed. September 20th, 2018, the Nguyen family arrived at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta, nervous and excited. They'd been assigned 2 ASL interpreters, Jessica and Marcus, both deaf themselves, who would voice their signs for the hearing audience and sign Steve's words back to the family. The opposing family, the Rodriguez family from Texas, were hearing. They'd been briefed about the situation. They were supportive but also curious. None of them had ever met a deaf person before. When the Nguyen family walked onto the stage, something immediately felt different. Usually there's nervous chatter, last-minute jokes, energy building through voices, but the Nguyen family moved in silence, their hands flying in conversation with each other, laughing without sound at something Tommy signed, their connection visible but inaudible. The studio audience didn't know what to expect. Neither did the crew. This was unprecedented in Family Feud's long history. Steve Harvey walked out to his usual applause. He approached the Nguyen family podium, and then, instead of speaking, he raised his hands and signed, "Welcome to Family Feud." His signing was slow. His hand shapes weren't perfect, but it was real. It was effort. The Nguyen family's faces transformed. David's eyes filled with tears. Lynn brought her hand to her mouth. Michael, Jenny, and Tommy were smiling so wide it looked like their faces might break. Because in that moment, they understood this wasn't going to be about accommodation or pity. This was going to be about respect. Steve spoke then, knowing the interpreters would translate. Nguyen family from Portland, Oregon. I am honored to have you here. I learned some sign language for you. Not a lot. I'm not good at it. But I wanted to try because you deserve that effort. Jessica, the interpreter, signed Steve's words. The family watched, then David signed back. Marcus voiced, "Steve, thank you. This means more than you know. We're ready to play." Steve smiled. He turned to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to do something we've never done before on Family Feud. And I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know if I'm going to be good at this, but we're going to figure it out together because that's what family does." The audience erupted in applause. The game began. The game that taught everyone a lesson. First question, name something people do when they're happy. Steve signed as he spoke, using the signs he'd learned. Name something people do happy. His grammar was wrong. In proper ASL, it would have been structured differently, but the Nguyen family understood his attempt. David buzzed in first. He signed his answer. Jessica voiced dance. Dance, Steve repeated. Show me dance. Number 2 answer on the board. 17 points. The Nguyen family won control. Steve went down the line asking family members for answers. Each time he attempted to sign the question before speaking it. Each time his signing was clumsy but earnest. Each time the family signed their responses, the interpreter voiced them, and Steve reacted with his usual animated style. Sing, smile, laugh. The round progressed smoothly, but something remarkable was happening that transcended the game itself. The studio audience was completely engaged. They were watching the interpreter's hands, seeing communication happen in a form most of them had never witnessed before. They were seeing a deaf family compete with the same energy, humor, and competitiveness as any hearing family. And they were watching Steve Harvey work harder than he'd ever worked on this show, trying to bridge two worlds with imperfect but sincere effort. By the third round, something shifted. Steve's signing was getting slightly better through practice. The family was anticipating his questions. The rhythm found itself. Question: name something a good friend does for you. Steve signed it. Good friend, do what? Wrong grammar. But David understood. He buzzed, signed his answer. Jessica voiced, listens. Steve paused. The word hung in the air with unexpected weight. Here was a deaf man saying that a good friend listens, not hears, listens. Because listening isn't about sound, it's about attention. It's about seeing. It's about seeing. It's about being present. Listens, Steve repeated quietly. Show me listens. Number 1 answer, 34 points. Steve looked at David. Then without speaking, Steve signed something he'd practiced. You teach me. David read the signs, understood. Signed back. You teach us too. The studio audience, not understanding the signed exchange, sensed its significance in the silence and the expressions. They erupted in applause. The moment that defined everything, fast money round. The Nguyen family had won the main game and advanced. David and Michael would play fast money. David went first. 5 questions, 25 seconds on the clock. Steve stood with his cards, ready, but before he started, he did something unscripted. He walked over to David, looked him in the eye, and signed, you are wonderful. David signed back, thank you, you too. Steve returned to his position. The interpreter stood ready to voice David's answers. The clock started. Name a place people go to relax. David signed, beach. Good. Name something you do every day. David signed, brush teeth. Name a reason you might stay up late. David signed, watching TV. Name something that makes you smile. David signed, my family. Steve paused. Even in the rapid pace of fast money, that answer landed differently. David had signed family with such clear emotion that it transcended language. Name something you're proud of. David signed his answer. Jessica voiced it, being deaf. The clock stopped. Steve looked at the answer. Being deaf, he repeated. You're proud of being deaf. David nodded. Through the interpreter he said, it's not something wrong with me, it's who I am. My family, my language, my culture. I'm proud. Steve Harvey, who had built a career on quick comebacks and comedy timing, had no joke, no quip. He just nodded slowly. I understand, he said quietly. And you should be proud. When David's answers were revealed, he'd scored 187 points. Michael needed only 13 to reach 200 and win $20,000. Michael came out from the isolation booth. His turn. 5 questions, 25 seconds. The questions flew. Michael signed his answers. The interpreter voiced them. One by one, points accumulated. Name a place people go to relax. Park. Name something you do every day. Eat. They'd won. The Nguyen family had won $20,000. But what happened next was what the audience would remember forever. Steve walked over to the Nguyen family. He raised his hands and signed the complete sentence he'd spent 3 weeks practicing. The one moment of perfect ASL grammar he'd managed to master. You made me better person. Thank you. Lynn, the mother, couldn't hold it together anymore. She cried. Not quiet tears, but full sobs. Her hands flew in signs that came too fast for Steve to understand. But the interpreter voiced, nobody ever does this for us. Nobody ever tries to learn our language. You didn't have to, but you did. You showed my children that they matter, that we matter, that deaf people belong everywhere. Thank you. Thank you. David put his arm around his wife. Michael, Jenny, and Tommy all had tears streaming down their faces. Steve pulled the entire family into a group hug. The studio audience gave a standing ovation that lasted 4 full minutes. The camera caught it all. The moment when a game show became something bigger, when entertainment became education, when effort became love. What happened after the cameras stopped? The episode aired 6 weeks later with special closed captioning that included descriptions of the signing. The deaf community response was overwhelming. Organizations for the deaf shared the episode across social media. Blog posts appeared, finally representation that respects us. Steve Harvey learned ASL and it matters. The Nguyen family showed America what we've always known: we can do anything. But the hearing community response was just as significant. Thousands of comments from hearing viewers. I never thought about deaf people watching game shows. I didn't know ASL was a real language with grammar. Steve trying to sign made me cry. I want to learn sign language now. Within a month of the episode airing, ASL class enrollment across the country spiked by 37%. Community colleges reported waiting lists for ASL courses. Online ASL learning platforms saw traffic increase by over 200%. The Nguyen family became unexpected advocates. They started a YouTube channel teaching basic ASL, showing deaf culture and explaining their daily lives. Within a year, they had 800,000 subscribers. Steve Harvey's foundation, inspired by the Nguyen family, launched the Sign It Forward initiative. They partnered with deaf educators to create free online ASL resources. They funded ASL interpreters for schools that couldn't afford them. They created a scholarship program for deaf students pursuing higher education. Steve himself continued learning ASL. He hired Maria Chen as a permanent consultant. He committed to having at least one deaf contestant or family on Family Feud every season, with proper accommodation and respect. The Nguyen family today. David Nguyen is now 52, still working as a graphic designer but also consulting with companies on deaf accessibility. Lynn is 52, still teaching at the Oregon School for the Deaf, but she also trains hearing teachers on how to better serve deaf students. Michael graduated with his architecture degree and now designs buildings with deaf accessibility as a primary focus. Not just wheelchair ramps and braille signs, but visual alert systems, optimal lighting for signing, acoustics that work with hearing aids. Jenny, now 26, runs a nonprofit connecting deaf youth with deaf mentors. She speaks at schools about deaf culture and ASL. Tommy, 23, is in college studying film production. He wants to make movies with deaf actors, deaf stories, deaf perspectives. Hearing people have told our stories for too long, he signs. It's time we tell them ourselves. The family still watches Family Feud every week. They still play along, signing their predictions, and every time they see Steve Harvey on screen, they remember September 20th, 2018, the day someone with a platform used it to show respect, instead of pity, effort, instead of perfection. Steve still keeps in touch with the Nguyen family. He texts, he follows their work, and once a year on the anniversary of their episode, he practices his ASL with Maria, making sure he doesn't forget what the Nguyen family taught him. That episode changed me, Steve has said in interviews. I thought I was being generous by learning some sign language, but the Nguyen family was generous to me. They taught me that communication isn't about words. It's about trying, it's about seeing people. It's about understanding that there are beautiful ways of expressing yourself that I never knew existed. They made me a better host. They made me a better person. Why this story matters? The Nguyen family's Family Feud appearance matters because representation matters. For millions of deaf people watching, it was the first time they'd seen a family like theirs on mainstream television. Not as inspiration porn, not as objects of pity, but as a regular family competing on a game show, being funny and competitive and normal. For hearing audiences, it was an introduction to deaf culture many had never experienced. It showed that ASL is a real complex language, that deaf people aren't broken hearing people, but people with their own culture, their own community, their own way of moving through the world. But more than representation, the episode mattered because of effort. Steve Harvey didn't have to learn ASL. He could have relied entirely on interpreters. Nobody would have blamed him. But he tried. And that effort communicated more than any perfect signing could have. You are worth my time. You are worth my work. You matter. In a world that often treats disabled people as problems to be solved or inspirations to be admired, Steve and the Nguyen family showed a different way: respect, curiosity, mutual learning. Two different communities meeting in the middle with imperfect but sincere effort to understand each other. The $20,000 the Nguyen family won went to various uses. some to Bill's, some to Tommy's college fund, and $5,000 to the Oregon School for the Deaf to create a new media lab where deaf students could learn video production, editing, and storytelling. But the real prize wasn't the money. It was the moment when deaf culture was seen, respected, and celebrated on national television. It was the spike in ASL learning. It was the kids who watched and thought, I can do that too. It was the hearing people who realized they'd been living in a limited world of only sound, missing the beautiful complexity of visual language. Steve Harvey keeps a photo in his office. It's from September 2018, the Nguyen family and Steve, all signing together, all laughing. Below it, Steve has written, "The day I learned that listening has nothing to do with ears." Every Family Feud contestant who comes through now, hearing or deaf, sees that photo, and they understand that this show, this stage, belongs to everyone willing to show up and try. Because that's what the Nguyen family and Steve Harvey proved. Family isn't about hearing the same language. It's about speaking the language of respect, effort, and love. And those languages, they need no sound at all.